Lost in desert wild is your little child. How can Lyca sleep if her mother weep? Welcome to another episode of Troubadour Podcast. Today we're going to read the poem The Little Girl Lost by William Blake. Now, as a reminder, if you have not been following the series on William Blake, which is the series I've been doing on songs of innocence and experience, then just a couple quick updates for you or introductions. This is a work published originally as Songs of Innocence in 1789 with just those songs or poems, and then republished as a packaged Songs of Innocence and Experience in 1794. And the subtitle is Showing the Two States of the Human Soul. And what you get in a lot of these poems are counterparts. Sometimes you'll see a counterpart in the Songs of Innocence, like you get the lamb in the Songs of Innocence and the tiger in the Songs of Experience. And I've been arguing a lot the importance of reading all of the poems in order to get a fuller understanding of each individual poem. Now, that is not to say that you cannot read these poems and that if you haven't done what I said, skip this and you won't get anything out of this poem that I'm about to read. I think you will. And, I'm not arguing to do that, but I'm saying that you will get more if you read all of it. I think there's a totality to it that is very useful. Now, this, I think, is a really fun poem, like a lot of Blake's poetry, in that it's fun to parse out what he's actually saying. It is very, if not completely, metaphorical. And we're going to talk about how it's not literal, although there is kind of a narrative story and a simple literal thing that occurs, or some people might take it as literal, but it's very metaphorical. And one background thing about Blake that I do think is necessary to understand is that he was a romantic poet, but he was the most Christian of all the romantic poets, in that he really, really, really believed in the visions of Christianity. That's not to say that other romantics did not at all believe in this. They did, or many of them did. But he really believed in it, and he believed in it so much that he also believed he had visions that added to the overall biblical imagery that were, these images that were passed from God to men in the past. That was his view of the biblical imagery. Now, what he is against, and this is going to be really important in this poetry, in this poem in particular, but all of his poems, is he is against the church. That is a formal way of passing on this knowledge by man, by an ordinary men in his view, not visionary men, usually not visionary men, unless they're like a Milton or a Dante, Paradise Lost and what's the Inferno by Dante. So he had that's where where Blake is coming from. And he is opposed to any form of oppression, that is the telling and the forcing of people to not feel or act or do what they desire, or repression, which is a kind of internal doing of the same activity of not doing something that you desire. And a lot of times this is sexual desire, because you are afraid of what it might do, or you feel like, you're not living up to some kind of, religious ideal or something. And he's actually against those. And so it's an interesting interplay. So what we're going to do is I'm going to read this poem. It will not make sense. I'm going to say that right now. It will very likely not make any sense to you. If it does, wow, you're amazing. But this has so much biblical imagery subtly put in there. It's not, in your face. And we're going to talk about, who he's writing for, what I think he's trying to say. And I think there's an important theme that comes out of this that is interesting to read. and understand. And I also think it's, even if you're not religious or Christian, it's really useful to see a good embodiment of the imagery and the metaphors and the ideas, and coming from a place of someone who is kind of criticizing it. Okay, so let's do this reading, and then we will go stanza by stanza and talk about it. The Little Girl Lost by William Blake. In futurity, I prophetic see that the earth from sleep, grave the sentence deep, shall arise and seek for her maker meek, and the desert wild become a garden mild. In the southern clime, where the summer's prime never fades away, lovely Lyca lay. 7 summers old, lovely Lyca told, she had wandered long, hearing wild birds' song. Sweet sleep, come to me, underneath this tree. Do father, mother weep? Where can Lyca sleep? Lost in desert wild is your little child. How can Lyca sleep if her mother weep? If her heart does ache, then let Lyca wake. If my mother sleep, Lyca shall not weep. Frowning, frowning night, o'er this desert bright, let thy moon arise while I close my eyes. Sleeping Lyca lay, while the beasts of prey come from caverns deep, viewed the maid asleep. The kingly lion stood, and the virgin viewed, and he gamboled around o'er the hallowed ground. Leopards, tigers play round her as she lay, while the lion old bowed his mane of gold. And her bosom lick, and upon her neck, from his eyes of flame, ruby tears there came. While the lioness loosed her slender dress, and naked they conveyed to caves the sleeping maid. There you go. That's the poem. And if you're baffled, that's good. Now, hopefully even in the first reading, you got a little taste of the narrative story that's going on. A young woman or a young girl, 7 years old, 7 summers old, falls asleep in a desert. She loses, contact with her parents, and she's alone. And so she kind of, and then she's spotted by these wild beasts who, one of them, the lion, the kingly lion, licks her. And then the lioness takes her into a cave. That's essentially the literal actions of the story. I should say that I forgot to mention the very beginning of the narrative, the little girl is kind of wandering away from her parents, following some birds, and then she gets lost, and then, she finds a tree and falls asleep, and that's when all the beasts come. Now, I've mentioned this before in other podcasts about Blake, but when Blake wrote this, he actually, if you were to buy this in like 1795, right, or 94 when he published this, this is what you would get. If you're watching the video on YouTube or Facebook, you'll see the video that I'm talking about, or on troubadourmag.com. You'll see this image, and he hand drew. So he drew this image. He made it a plate that could be printed. But if you were to buy a William Blake Songs of Innocence and Experience in 1794, he would have hand colored this himself. So when you received it, or when you went to the store or wherever to buy it, you would get this copy, and the poet himself had colored it. Now, it was a plate that printed that he created, but I always found that just fascinating that he, this is one of the, he had this just such intense vision for what he did. But because of that, I think that's one reason why he was also not very popular, because he didn't make very many of these, in his lifetime. Okay. But there is, this is an interesting image if you're listening and not watching or you can't see this, what we're seeing here is a young woman. And let me see if I can. Yeah, try to zoom in a little bit here. It's a young woman who looks like she's kissing a young man, or her mouth is, and she's pointing up. And there's a lot of, vines and trees, and there's a little bird at the top. And so, but this is interesting that we get this narrative about Leica, and we don't see Leica, at least not 7-year-old Leica, but what we do see is a woman kissing a man. And so there's something that he's trying, I think that's important. And it looks like there's a little dog at their feet. I think it's important to kind of understand that this is what the artist, William Blake, wanted you to see visually while you were imbibing the words. Now, another thing I'll point out real quick before we go into the analysis of this stanza is that William Blake does this sometimes where in his plates and these drawings, he actually separates these first two stanzas. So when we look at this, we'll see this, but so when you're reading it, there's a big old vine that pops out, and the vine actually looks like a snake. At least to me, I don't know. It's got to be a snake. I mean, let me take that back. It's a vine with a snake on it. And that part actually separates the first two stanzas structurally from the rest. And when we look at it, there's a really good reason for this. The first two stanzas are not actually part of the narrative. And after the vine and the snake, there is the narrative of the story of Leica. Before that, there's a kind of frame that those first two stanzas do. And let's get into talking about this frame for these first two stanzas and what are we looking at here. And this is going to get into a lot of the biblical imagery we were talking about and the kind of biblical metaphors. So here we go. Here's the first two stanzas. I'm going to read them together. In futurity, I prophetic see that the earth from sleep, grave the sentence deep, shall arise and seek for her maker meek, and the desert wild become a garden mild. So think about that for a second. Before we get the story of the girl Leica, the 7-year-old girl, we're getting a prophecy of the future. In futurity, I prophetic see, right? He's seeing the future, that the earth from sleep, grave the sentence deep. So grave, we know, so this is a sentence. So we think about like a prison sentence. So the earth and maybe the people on the earth have been sentenced to something. And it's grave, which, can be serious and also deadly and having to do with death, right? Graves. But it's also, a grave matter that he's talking about. And this sentence, or this, sentence, but also sentence as in the grammatical structure. But the sentence continues, shall arise and seek for her maker meek, and the desert wild become a garden mild. So what's the sentence? Now, I kind of give you a hint that there's a biblical thing. So think about a sentence that has to do with deep or falling. And because we have the imagery of arising. Right? So if you're arising, what had happened before? I mean, you could say you can awaken, and that's part of it. And then for her maker meek, right? So we're talking about probably Jesus, right? The meek shall inherit the earth. And then look at the last two lines, the desert wild, the garden mild. So we have a kind of comparison between the desert and the garden, the cultivated garden. Now, I would contend that when it says that the earth from sleep, grave the sentence deep, this is actually a reference to the fall of humankind, the fall of, after Adam and Eve ate from, or after they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and they, became aware of themselves, particularly sexually. They were aware that they were naked. They were cast out. And he's comparing it, I think, to the whole earth that graved the sentence deep. And so they were given a sentence, And I think the whole earth or all the people on it were given that sentence as well. But he's saying that in the future, he sees a prophecy where humankind will arise and eventually seek their maker, God, or Jesus, or whoever, the person who, makes people mild, and the desert wild become a garden mild. And so there's kind of references to the Israelites in the desert, right, going through it, and finding the promised land. And that is also, I think, a reference to the Garden of Eden. Now, these are all just kind of setting the emotional language from the Bible. And he's trying to, frame the story of Laika in that, or he's placing the story of Laika in that framework. Okay, so we have this prophecy. What happens next? So now we get the picture of a girl. In the southern clime, so here we're talking, think like, southern clime as opposed to like the North Pole. So we're talking, think North Africa. And, we're talking about like a hot deserted area, Egypt or something. It doesn't say exactly where, but in the southern clime, where the summer's prime never fades away, lovely Laika lay. So we have this image of this girl laying down, right, in this desert, or at least this hot summer. We don't have the desert image except from before, right? That is kind of what he's saying we're in, but he's Laika is somewhat separated from that, or she's framed within it, but that first two stanzas are more the frame. They're not directly a part of the narrative. So we have this little 7-year-old girl laying down. And here's the next stanza. 7 summers old, lovely Laika told, she had wandered long, hearing wild bird songs. So now we're hearing about how she got to that laying down place, right? So she's only 7 summers old. She's young, 7 years old. And she's told, we don't know by who, or we might find out later, that she had wandered hearing wild birds and, their song. And that's how she came to where she was. She had wandered a long time. Sweet sleep, come to me underneath this tree. Do father and mother weep? Where can Laika sleep? So this isn't in the version I have in quotation, so it can be a little confusing. But I think what's happening here is she's saying, sweet sleep, come to me underneath this tree, or it did come to me. And now she's thinking, do my mother and father weep? When they say, and this is in quotations, where can Laika sleep? So she's talking about here that she fell asleep under this tree, and now she's wondering, or some narrator, maybe we could say, is wondering, does her parents weep? And ask themselves, where can Laika sleep? Like, where is my daughter? So they're weeping because they can't find their daughter. Now, I want to say something about this tree. If you think of her in this southern clime, possibly a desert, she's in a tree. So we have this summer. And remember, we're in this, if we think about the biblical imagery here, we're in the time of the fall. So the Eden, the Garden of Eden, right? This perfectly cultivated, absolute wonderful, take care of all the fruits and vegetables that you could ever wonder, all these beautiful, you can walk around naked because the climate is perfect. All of that is gone. And we now, in this narrative, because we haven't come out of the desert wild, we're now in this desert land. And that's where Laika is placed, of course. So she's in this desert and there's this lone tree and she fell asleep. And of course, the lone tree, this tree definitely has connotations or has metaphorical relations to, the Bible of the tree of good and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Lost in desert wild. There's the desert. Okay. So we know she's lost in desert wild. Is your little child? That's the answer to where can the parents are asking, where can Laika sleep? So the answer is, well, she's lost in the desert and that's where your little child is. And then the next part of this stanza is, how can Laika sleep if her mother weep? So there's something on, this is, I think, is actually getting into the psychology a little bit. How can she sleep if she knows that her mother is weeping? And so there's something about, her inability to address or to overcome the things that her mother might be afraid of. And when we look at the whole theme of this, that'll be, I think, an important element that seems innocuous. But this idea of Leica is separated from her parents. She's thinking about what her parents are worried about, which is her. And she's thinking about, I can't sleep. Like I have something on my mind. I can't sleep because my mother is probably weeping about me. So keep that in mind when you think about the what's on Leica's mind or what might be on Leica's mind. If her heart does ache, that's the mother, let Leica wake. So the mother's fears are bothering or, interfering in the sleep or the, a different consciousness of Leica, it's also her aching of the mother is waking up, I should say, Leica. If my mother sleep, Leica shall not weep. So now we have a kind of reversal that if the mother is calm and okay, then Leica doesn't need to cry about that, situation. Next stanza. Frowning, frowning night, o'er this desert bright, let your moon arise while I close my eyes. So Leica is in this nighttime over the desert, and she's thinking about the moon arising while she closes her eyes. So I think there's just a kind of continuation and adding to the imagery in that stanza. Next stanza is sleeping like a lay while the beasts of prey come from caverns deep, viewed the maid asleep. Now, in the Bible and in Christian tradition, and we're going to get a line later, leopards, tigers play, we have a lion and a lioness, that these wild beasts of prey, think of the wolf and the Little Red Riding Hood, represent predatory forces. And I think it's important, again, to know these kinds of things, that it represents predatory forces. At least that's what they traditionally represent. Sleeping like a lay while the beasts of prey, right? So these are beasts of prey. These are beasts who find prey. And they come out of caverns deep, right? They come from outs, like in, the bowels of the earth, and they're kind of like these hellhounds that come out. And they view this maid asleep. Now, of course, we're going to find she's a virgin. I mean, she's 7 years old. So we have the kingly lion stood. And now, again, you could think of this literally or metaphorically, whatever, the adjective kingly about the lion or the, I guess, describe the modifier of kingly, that it's a certain kind of lion. But also, by, I think, bringing in the word kingly, we do have a humanistic lion here. So it's a kind of human. Okay, so the kingly lion stood, and the virgin viewed, not the virgin viewed the kingly lion, but the kingly lion saw the virgin. Then he gamboled around, he kind of danced around over the hallowed ground. There's a, reference to the kind of holiness of this maiden. Next stanza. Leopards, tigers play round her as she lay. So kind of try to picture that for a moment. You have these leopards and these tigers kind of playing around her as Leica's lying down under this tree in the desert. While the lion old bowed his mane of gold. So just kind of try to visualize that. Now, here's where it gets weird. And her bosom lick. And if you try to be like, if you're trying to be too repressed yourself, think of like licking her whole bosom, like really her whole chest, and upon her neck, from his eyes of flame, ruby tears there came. I think the ruby tears, is red is ruby. I think there's something relating to, again, her well, I guess you could say menstruation, but her becoming a woman. I think that part of that poem, this part of the stanza is very clear on that. This is sexual imagery, period. I mean, no pun intended on the period in terms of, it's very clear. And, trying to read out of it what you want and saying that, oh, it's some kind of, it's just like a dog licking. No, I mean, he's licking her bosom, licking her neck, right? And then he, in his eyes of flame. So think about passion. So this king is passionate. While the lioness loosed her slender dress. So now this, little girl's naked, and naked they conveyed to caves the sleeping maid. Okay. Now, what is the theme of this thing? Now, I think it can take, it's taken me a while to reading this over a period of time. And knowing Blake, I think it helps to know a little bit about Blake. Although I think it's in the poem as well, but it's just, being separated from him, in his time. One thing is, I believe, or I'm very confident, partly because I've read about this, but his audience is going to be Christians. Now, when I say Christians, I don't mean Christians like today's Christians, like American Christians or, European Christians even, where, there's a kind of, they're Christian in name only type thing, or they go to church when it's convenient occasionally. Maybe they've read a couple passages of the Bible. These are Christians who memorize the Bible, front page to last page, right? They hear it, even if they don't memorize it, they read it a lot. They get told stories from priests all the time, every day, every week. They go religiously, and they're very serious about their religion. And I think that's an important thing to remember is that, so this is part of the audience is those types of people. And he's trying to give a commentary showing them a different side and kind of using their own imagery to kind of play with their emotions in a sense. What I think is going on is Blake's view of, two things. So one thing is his view that is in the poem, and I think is in a lot of his work, that repressions, sexual repressions in particular, are actually inculcated in us from church teachings and from images and thoughts from, things like fallenness. And, he was against sexual repression. And it's really hard for us to, we have to take this metaphorically. And I think you can get in your own way when you take it literally, the idea of a 7-year-old having sex, right? And you get obvious negative connotations for good reason, right? A 7-year-old should not be having sex. But it's important to take it, I think, metaphorically in the sense that 7 years old is very young, but he's taking that in a few short years, this young girl, and he believes, I think on some level, which may be true, I don't know, psychologically, where at 7 years is a important starting point for a young girl into being able to see herself as this future woman. And in other words, she's on the verge of losing her innocence. And remember, this is Songs of Innocence and Experience. And this is in the Songs of Experience. And he placed it here for a reason. It was originally in the Songs of Innocence when that was published in 1789, but he took it out of that one and put it in Songs of Experience because he saw it, I think, as, this is the coming to age. This is the little girl lost, right? So this is losing the little girl, and that every woman goes through. Now, you have to try to get away from the literal 7-year-old thing that's gonna get in your way. You have to think of it as a psychological representation, this Leica character. In fact, the word Leica comes from a Latin word, I think lucis or lux lucis, which basically means the light or light giver or light seer, I should say. And so there's something about her as awakening and seeing for the first time. And so you get that imagery of her coming out of the desert into the garden, into the promised land. But there's a kind of reversal at the end where she goes in the cave. And, this is in a sense, that's kind of, I think, the cave is placed in that same category as the promised land. And although we as the reader may be a little bit worried if we take it too literally, the idea of a young girl being, having her loosed, the lioness loosed her slender dress and conveyed her into the caves, and especially after the actions of the lion, which was just licking her all over her body. But again, I think the important thing is her seeing herself as this sexual being. And this is the awakening of her seeing herself one day in the future as a woman, right? This is, it's 7 is young, and especially in modern times, I think it's particularly young. When we, childhood is extended a lot more than it was hundreds of years ago. But even back then, of course, childhood, 7 years old was still very young. And so again, I think it's it's vital to see her as this psychological representation in a big way, where it's not literally she's having sex. It's that is what he is arguing is that this is the beginning. Like if you pinpoint where does the awareness of the future woman, start, he is saying it starts around here, or that this is what Leica represents. And in his view, he put her at 7 summers old. Okay, so that's my song and dance about trying to get away from pedophilia, get away from those types of ideas. He's trying to, convey this idea that there is a playfulness, and I think it's analogous to our deepest fears of pedophilia today, actually, that we are so, it's so hard to say this. I mean, obviously it's not good for children this age to do anything sexual. Okay. So I don't want to, say anything like that. I'm trying to convey the different values of a culture he's trying to criticize for getting in the way of young people who are trying to. Okay, let me give you another example. That might help. Think about teaching kids about the birds and the bees, and that's what is kind of happening. Except what he's, I think, arguing is that he wants there to be a kind of tell them everything. This is my, if we're going to talk about like a modern interpretation, tell them all, show them the pictures, let them see that it's a good thing, that it's a paradise, that there's a value to it. And there's something that gets in the way. There's 2 things I think that get in the way. And that is the sentence deep, or the fall itself, that gets in the way of the young girl seeing and in the future enjoying the paradise. That's what this poem is about, is that the fall, or the imagery passed down by the church in particular, or in this case, like the story passed down over and over again to young girls, that they should be ashamed of their sexuality, right? That's what we're taught when Eve saw her, that she was naked and she was ashamed. And, that's something that he's actually criticizing, even though I said he was very Christian. And he believes that this is a psychological thing. So this is like pre-Freud, who really got into a little bit more of this sexuality idea of that these are repressed notions that are built into us. And he believed that we have these repressed fears in our head, and we kind of create authoritative figures like the church, like parents in this case. So in this case, we have the fears of the parents. So Leica is about to have this adventure with a lion and a lioness and predatory animals that we think of as negative, but there's actually a playfulness to them. So I hope you understand the importance of this, is that in the imagery of this poem, which is about biblical, animals are predators and they're bad, right? Again, the wolf and the little Red Riding Hood. But Blake is turning that on its head, and he's saying, there's an enjoyment to this. So it's kind of like, if we put this up to like, something that's more comfortable to us, like an 18-year-old girl, it would be like telling an 18-year-old girl, yeah, there's going to be a lot of, F boys, go have some fun with them, right? Like have a little, be safe, be smart, whatever, but have some fun. You're at a peak, time, find a good guy would be the ideal, but don't not have fun. Don't not enjoy your sexual desires. And that, I think, is the core of this whole poem. And now it's put in a fantasy element of this girl falling asleep. And this whole thing is put in that fantasy element. Okay, so I hope that kind of helps a little bit. I did want to show you this before we leave today. That the mother weeping and the father weeping and the father the parents worrying, that makes Leica hesitate, or it makes it harder for her to fall into this kind of sleepfulness, which is this kind of sexual fantasy, you can think of it as, and have that experience that gets in, the parents get in the way. And this is what I was talking about with these structures in our mind get in the way of our enjoying our sexual pleasures and our sexual desires, which again are a good thing, according to Blake. And so, that I think is really important. And remember, he's telling this to a bunch of repressed Christians who are very, you have to wait till marriage. You can't, these are the things that they're telling, like, being virginal is the utmost of all virtues, right? Like that's especially for a girl. And he's telling about a 7-year-old who goes and has even in fantasy form, a sexual desire dream. And he's saying, and he's basically couching it in biblical terms, biblical imagery that he flips on his head. And it's kind of like, go enjoy those predators, right? Have some fun with them. Again, not literally at 7 years old, but when of age, right? Which, at this era might be more like, after they've hit puberty, of course. And we're talking more like 15, 16 is the equivalent of 18 today, but that's another discussion. Okay, so that's the poem. And I'll end by saying the next poem we're going to read is called The Little Girl Found. So we're going to talk about that. And now I think The Little Girl Lost is a wonderful poem because, again, we could spend a lot more time looking at how each of these stanzas kind of play into the entirety of the theme that I was talking about. You even get this, you can even really dig into this with like the images of the moon and how she closes her eyes and she wants to, but the night is frowning at her, right? And there's a kind of judgmentalness to it. But then when she finally does, she's asleep, that's when the beasts of prey come out of the cavern. And there's that feeling of they're coming out of the cavern and to get her. And there's a scariness to it, to the audience. But of course we learn that it's scary if you're afraid of sex, but really it's just about a young virgin losing her virginity. And then there's, of course, the plate that I showed you. Let me show you again one more time, actually. That plate of, the young girl and the boy. And again, so if you think about it as, and she's kissing the boy. So if you think of it as this is a sexual story, this is the image that you're doing. And she's pointing up to the birds that, maybe that's a reference to when she was a little girl, she got lost. And, remember she was hearing the wild birds and she had this sexual fantasy, and now she's living it here on earth, and she has her dog, and now she has her man with her, and she's able to enjoy her, love and love and sex. So that, I think, is a full experience of this poem. I hope you enjoyed that. And I will see you next time.